In early 2008, the GameCube my brother and I both grew up with since the summer of 2002 died. And we went most of that year, including the summer, without it, leaving our collection of about 30 games left to gather dust. But later that year, deep within the upstate New York fall season, we went to a GameStop at a mall where they sold certified refurbished consoles. It was at that time when I used my $30 gift card to buy a new or certified refurbished Nintendo GameCube. And the first game I decided to play on it was Shadow the Hedgehog. Ever since then, it's become somewhat of a weird compulsion for me to revisit this worst Sonic game of all time contender every year around the holidays. After replaying through the game a year ago and playing it again to get all the A ranks this year, I think I'm prepared to explain properly how to articulate what it is exactly that brings me back to this oft-hated Sonic game released in the twilight of the 6th generation of consoles. Now, I grew up with this game on the GameCube, and as of writing this script, that copy of that game is safe in the possession of my brother in America. I live in Japan, and I've been in the process of buying back all the Sonic games I grew up with, on top of those I never owned on consoles I didn't previously have. Sonic games are not common in Japan. They're pretty hard to find, actually, and when they do show up, they aren't cheap. A year ago, when I was looking for Shadow the Hedgehog, I could only find copies of the game available for PlayStation 2 and, bafflingly enough, Xbox. I found not a single GameCube copy, and since I don't have an original Xbox, my only option was the PlayStation 2 version of the game. It's this version I captured my long play footage from, and the one I earned all the A ranks on this year. Getting the A ranks and finishing expert mode in Shadow the Hedgehog has been quite the experience for me. When I was a kid, I was always of the impression that Shadow the Hedgehog had the strictest A ranks of all the Sonic games I had at the time. Maybe that's actually true, I'm honestly not sure. But through playing this version of Shadow the Hedgehog, the least optimal version, I've learned a lot about how Shadow the Hedgehog is meant to be played. Listening to some of the more popular reviews of Shadow the Hedgehog by much more established YouTube reviewers than myself, it's interesting to hear what they have to say and how much it contrasts from my experience of going through and getting all the A ranks and finishing expert mode. And so now I find myself here once again white knighting for a game that is popularly disliked by many. But I think the case here might be stronger than the one I made for Sonic and the Secret Rings. But first I should talk about this PS2 port and get that giant elephant in the room out of the way first. For my long play of Shadow the Hedgehog, I didn't really notice anything especially off about the quality of the port in terms of performance. It wasn't exactly the way I remembered it being, but I was so far removed from the GameCube version I grew up with playing that it was hard to really get an idea for the difference in the feel between the two ports. But then I played the game again, and now I can say with certainty that this port is rough. From the outset, the game chugs and it rarely ever feels very smooth. Eyeballing it, it really does look and feel as though the game struggles meeting 30 FPS most of the time. This could be due to a number of different factors, but I think probably the main culprit is an issue with memory management. The way the memory is organized in the PS2, despite a super fast memory controller and cache on the Emotion Engine itself, the capacity for that memory cache is very limited, which forces developers to stream and load data into the PS2's main memory, which is slower and still limited compared to what is available on the Xbox and GameCube. This leads to a lot of different kinds of glitches like short draw distances, level geometry occasionally not being rendered fast enough, and very choppy frame rates during high speed sections. This leads to the game feeling heavier and more sluggish than it actually is, and many times it can feel unresponsive. There are also frame time issues as well, where spikes can happen that can leave you careening off ledges or crashing into enemies. The PS2 is targeting 60 FPS, and it really only seems to hit that target in these types of very close quarters situations. Performance suffers the most in the city and arc levels in my experience, with Lost Impact being the rock bottom in terms of performance. The best performance is seen in the cyberspace stages, where there is a lot of mostly empty space and comparatively less level geometry overall. Shadow the Hedgehog is a late 6th generation game, and it is pretty graphically intense for what it's asking of the hardware. However, these performance issues, in my opinion, aren't really indicative of the assumption by many that the PS2 is a weak, underpowered console compared to the GameCube and Xbox. I believe the PS2 can run this game better, but since this is a multi-platform game, and the GameCube in particular has an architecture that this game was clearly most optimized for, the PS2 port suffers from a lack of the finesse required to get a game like this running optimally, and that's honestly the nature of multi-platform games back in this time, unfortunately. Graphically speaking, the PS2 is a downgrade from the other ports. This kind of goes without saying, since it's been demonstrated that the differences are noticeable, though this port does have better polish than Sonic Heroes, more or less. That being said, I do think Shadow the Hedgehog doesn't suffer too much from these cutbacks in lighting and texture quality, and I still think the game looks good for a 2005 PS2 title. I really don't think I appreciated the graphics of this game at all until now. When I look at the visuals of Shadow the Hedgehog now, I can't help but to be pretty impressed with some of the details of the stages and the character models. The character animations aren't nearly what other games at the time were doing, of course, but I think the quality of the gameplay graphics makes up for that. Now, everything looks low poly and blurry, but for 2005 standards, for such a fast-moving platformer, the level of detail in some of these environments and the characters kind of has me thinking that this was a decent-looking game for its time, even on PS2. I think it is an improvement over Sonic Heroes, which itself was also a pretty impressive-looking game, especially on GameCube. So now that we have graphics and performance out of the way, and keeping in mind the performance issues of the PS2 version, I will now try to explain what it is about Shadow the Hedgehog that actually makes it an enjoyable game. Now, it might seem to be like the ultimate cope when someone says that a game gets better after spending a certain amount of time with it, but it really is true with Shadow the Hedgehog, as long as you keep in mind the playstyle it's trying to get you to play it with. Shadow the Hedgehog is running on the same renderware technology as its predecessor, Sonic Heroes, but there seem to have been some tweaks to Shadow's movement compared to the movement in Sonic Heroes. Shadow is very light and extremely agile, and it's this movement tech that plays directly into the level design and the intended play style of the game. It might seem silly to point it out, but there is a nuance that definitely separates the play style of Shadow the Hedgehog to the more popular games in the adventure style. You have to do things quickly, of course. That's how Sonic games have always been, even in games like Sonic Labyrinth. But what makes Shadow the Hedgehog different is that the highest speeds you reach aren't necessarily meant to be restrained for extreme periods of time. Not that I'm aware of, at least. Things like the spin dash don't behave the same way as they did in previous games, but that's because it can't, for example. Shadow the Hedgehog is unique to other previous Sonic games because its levels are mostly mission-based. It's not necessarily always about reaching the end of the obstacle course to the goal ring as fast as possible. Everyone knows at this point that the game requires multiple playthroughs in order to unlock the final story. This is accomplished by finishing the different missions across a 6-stage story course to each one of the 10 boss fights. There are normal, hero, and dark missions, and every stage has at least 2 missions, and it's up to you which mission you choose, which in turn determines the story path you take. This results in several different stories you can potentially experience over the course of a playthrough of the game. To be honest, I really didn't find it to be so much of a chore to unlock the last story or the true ending. I will concede that fighting the same selection of 3 final bosses can be a bit tedious, since the variation between these fights are minuscule, but really I don't see any percent completion of the game as so much of an ordeal as some reviewers have made it out to be. Again, level goals are mission-based, and while there are at least 2 missions per level, there are a comparatively limited number of mission types. Missions range from activating or destroying a certain number of things, destroying a single large thing before the end of the stage, taking out a certain number of enemies, finding something, or reaching the goal ring. There are a comparatively limited number of missions, but I fail to see where there is an excessive repetition or padding here. The strength in the game isn't in the variety of missions themselves, but the variety offered to those missions by the level designs. While there is some repetition of some aspects of certain stage layouts, there is still some variation between these levels that is significant enough to give them their own personality, while also placing them believably within the same area as the other levels. Continuity, right? You are inevitably bound to play through the same level at least one additional time, aside from the first level. But because of the sheer number of combinations of paths you can take through them, it's hard to imagine totally exhausting more than maybe a couple of them by the end of a story-strict playthrough. But ultimately, what Shadow the Hedgehog begs for is multiple playthroughs for its levels for the best rank. Shadow the Hedgehog once again includes a ranking system that is right along the same lines as its predecessors. But since the game is mission-based, the scoring system is something you have to pay a bit more attention to than you might have had to in previous games. Shadow the Hedgehog has 3 different potential scores that will contribute to your final score at the end of stages, and it's all dependent on which mission you complete. You have a hero score, a dark score, and a normal score. For the most part, depending on whether you choose a hero or dark mission, the score you have to worry about the most is actually the opposite score value. For example, if you're going for a hero mission A rank, you have to go through and accomplish that mission as fast as possible for that generous time bonus. Really, most of the time, your time bonus is what ultimately pushes you over the edge for the A rank, though in this case, your hero score will also make a difference. Your normal score does contribute somewhat, but it's seldom very high and never makes any difference. You also have a ring bonus, but again, it's not as consequential. Okay, but so why worry about the dark score in this case? Well, if you do things while pursuing the hero mission that contribute to your dark score, the end level score calculations will actually reduce your hero score sometimes to 0 depending on how high your dark score is relative to your hero score. This can absolutely ruin your otherwise perfect run for the A rank and force you to try again. Some points in levels will force you to do things to contribute to the opposite score, but if done quickly enough, the time bonus can offset the loss. Because of this surprisingly deep scoring system, it can lend itself to making the player develop further optimized runs of the levels and thereby add to the game's overall replayability. I really don't think that simply playing through the game for the story is really enough to truly understand the game's direction as far as gameplay is concerned. Just playing through the story doesn't really require you to be any good at the game, much to everyone's surprise, I'm sure. You don't really need to master the game at all to be able to finish it. You can get all E ranks and still see the ending. But if you're getting all E ranks, you're probably not doing very well at the game, and as a consequence of that, you probably don't have a very high opinion of it. What's more, E ranks inadvertently suggest that you don't even really know what you're doing. This, of course, is an extreme example for rhetorical purposes, but simply beating Shadow the Hedgehog doesn't really mean you can totally understand what it's going for, especially if you have experience with other 3D Sonic games. Would it be elitist of me to say that there is a correct way to play Shadow the Hedgehog? After getting the A ranks for this game, I've realized that if you really want to get Shadow the Hedgehog, you have to meet it at its level and really try to understand it. It kind of goes without saying, but you should always approach a game on its own terms rather than having expectations on how you think it should handle based on your own preconceptions of the series it's in. Shadow the Hedgehog is different from Sonic Heroes and the adventure games. As before, Shadow is a lot more agile and a lot lighter than how previous games felt. His acceleration is very high and with a high top speed to boot, but he can also stop on a dime. What becomes important in Shadow the Hedgehog isn't just running through fast, but also being accurate with judging your speed and jumps. This game is a lot more precise than previous games, and so it's worthwhile to be mindful of how fast you're going. Because of how twitchy Shadow can feel, you might find yourself somewhat inching yourself through the stages on a first playthrough, but once you get the handle of the stage layouts and enemy placements, and Shadow's movements, and the fact that he can stop almost instantly, you can find yourself flying through certain parts of stages pretty confidently, even on the PS2 version. At the same time, though, you can't just run at full speed all the time. Sometimes you need to modulate your speed, even in levels you're familiar with. I don't remember when, but it reminded me of an episode of DF Retro where Audie and John played one of the Bubsy games, where Audie remarked that even though Bubsy handles similarly to Sonic and has a similar potential top speed, the best way to navigate the levels is with a deliberate, steady pace rather than a chaotic, breakneck speed. Shadow the Hedgehog's platforming operates with the same concept in mind, especially when you take into consideration the missions. When you can master or at least get the hang of Shadow's movement and let go of the fact that you aren't spin dash jumping to skip entire parts of levels and focusing on the mission at hand, you will find that securing the game's 71A ranks is more of a cinch than you might have been led to assume. If I can do it, I think anyone can. Look, I'm not gonna lie. I do have a lot of nostalgia for Shadow the Hedgehog. It's my holiday game. It takes me back to when the holidays were at their peak of magic quotes for me. 2004, 2005, and 2006. The chill in the outside air, but the warm lighting of the incandescent bulbs we still used, the sound emanating from the old faux wood console TV in our living room, the warmth radiating from the oven which just got done baking a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies, and the resulting smell filling the whole house. Life was good when Shadow the Hedgehog came out, and in 2008, it was this feeling I was taken back to when I decided that it would be the game that November night I would christen my new refurbished GameCube with. But in spite of that fact, when I went through Shadow the Hedgehog again all these years later and played through the stages with the intent of getting all the A ranks, I finally felt like I could really get the game in a way I never did before. Maybe it's not everyone's cup of tea for a Sonic platformer, but I think that if you really gave it a chance and tried to really play by its rules, I think you'd actually find a solid experience worth having here. Sure, there are some valid complaints. The game could benefit immensely from a more comprehensive lock-on mechanic for the guns, especially rocket launchers and grenade launchers can be pretty jank. The homing attack can be a bit wishy-washy in what it chooses to lock onto, or if it locks onto anything at all. But, you know, that is really all a consequence of being a game from the 6th generation of consoles. People love to say how much better games during this era were compared to modern games, and while I do have a lot of affection for these games, it is the generation of my childhood after all, there is still a good amount of jank in these games that have long since been ironed out of the design of modern games. If you really want to experience these old games, then you have to accept that they are going to have moments of hilariously strange jank, and that's okay. It was a different time, and our tolerance for this level of jank was a lot higher. It's like playing NES Metroid after playing Super Metroid and wondering how anyone tolerated the design of the former. I guess I should address the story, or at least touch on it, though I feel as though discussing it in a post-Sonic X Shadow Generations world is kind of cheating, since that story went and basically corrected a lot of what the Sonic game timeline has been through until recently in terms of its continuity. But I have to admit, even going back to Sonic Adventure 2, I was always a little confused about the timeline for Gerald Robotnik and when in that timeline he made his revenge plan and how long it took after the military raid on the Ark. That part especially confused me as a kid, and the story elements added with Shadow the Hedgehog and Shadow being the product of a deal made with Black Doom and Gerald's building of the Eclipse cannon to actually take out the Black Comet rather than Earth, and when all that happened also really confused me. Now this has all been alleviated, but I remember as a kid understanding the sentiment of the story, but noticing how it started to come apart at the seams upon closer examination. I didn't feel that the alternate timelines in the game offered to the player were ever meant to be understood as canon, but rather as potential alternative futures for Shadow. Ultimately, I do believe that the true ending for the last story is the most consistent with Shadow's character as presented to us in Sonic Heroes, and I think it is the ending that made the most sense. Shadow wakes up not knowing anything about his past, and everyone around him is reluctant to say anything, likely because he might actually be a robot and not actually have those memories. It is heavily implied, however, at the end of Team Dark's story that the original Shadow must exist, since the original is necessary if you're going to make clones of him. The implication being that Shadow in Sonic Heroes could very well be the Shadow from Sonic Adventure 2. In Shadow the Hedgehog, we confirm beyond all doubt that he is indeed that same Shadow from Sonic Adventure 2, and we follow him through the steps of remembering the past, who he is, why he came into being, and realizing that that past and his origins don't need to define him. He decides to let it all go and be who he feels is true to himself now. So no, you don't play through Shadow the Hedgehog 10 different times just to find out none of it ever mattered and that it was a waste of time. It was all part of Shadow's journey to understanding who he is and can be and accepting that. Shadow has always had a strong anxiety about his past. His memory has never been perfect. Even in Sonic Adventure 2, Gerald Robotnik altered his memories to make him believe that he needed to take revenge on the Earth for what happened to Maria. His memories have always been broken, and broken by others against his will. The only thing that makes sense for him to do is to let go and forge a future for himself instead of chasing ghosts of his past. And all this you can get from Shadow the Hedgehog's story in its overall themes. Maybe as a kid I couldn't quite articulate it, but I understood it. Maybe its presentation wasn't entirely clear, but I think a closer critical examination of the story and its themes can shed light on the story containing more than just edgy Sonic with a gun. That being said, the English localization really did Shadow the Hedgehog a disservice. It is the most regrettable part of the English version of the game. I don't know who thought it was a good idea to have Shadow be as unhinged as possible for an E10 plus rated game, but I have to say it was a poor one. The Japanese dialogue just makes so much more sense. Listening to Shadow in the Japanese version, he sounds so much more close to how he sounded in the previous games in terms of how he expressed himself. It's not a mistake of the original script, but what the localization did to alter it to make it supposedly more appealing to American audiences. This past year, Shadow the Hedgehog has enjoyed more positive reevaluation by a newer generation of YouTube critics. While the nature of YouTube criticism always swings from one extreme to the next, I know there will be a counter movement calling Shadow the Hedgehog the worst game of all time, actually, and then a counter to that, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. I don't really want to contribute to that, although I guess I kind of am with this video. But I understand that this is not a perfect game, and I can also understand that not everyone is going to see it the way I do, or those of us who do like it. And again, that's fine. It's hard to call someone wrong for not liking a game because they didn't put more than the amount of time into it necessary to finish the story. If the game's story mode isn't enough to win someone over, then it's hard to justify why its post-game challenges should also be explored. On the other hand, I firmly believe that Shadow the Hedgehog at its heart is a well-focused game with a clear design intent, with a structure and level designs that reflect that. I find that if you mildly enjoyed the game when you first played through it, you might get significantly more enjoyment from it by getting its A ranks. I really believe that. I promise once you learn the rules of the game, A ranks aren't a tall order. Some are tricky. If you're playing on an optimal platform or even emulating it, it should be even easier. Watching video guides online illustrates exactly the way you can play the game, and you'd be surprised what a little level memorization and repeated playthroughs can do with your gameplay. If you made it this deep into the video, play some Shadow the Hedgehog today, get some A ranks, and keep retromaxing.